IVM.
David Chang is famous for loving his meat. As the chef and owner of the Momofuku chain of restaurants, he happens to be one of the most influential names in food. When he opened his first restaurant, David was so vocal about his love for meat, he actually announced that none of his menus were vegetarian friendly. Cut to 2016. He tried a product called the Impossible Burger for the first time, and soon he was the first chef to serve the Impossible Burger at his New York restaurant Nishi. The reason was simple. It wasn't because this was a plant-based burger that bled or tasted exactly like a meat burger. David Chang just felt it was delicious. Soon, a small group of American influential chefs like Tracy Desjardins, Michael Simon, and Chris Consento were declaring their love for the bleeding plant-based Impossible Burger just like Chang. And people began to think this burger was a symbol of exclusive, unattainable, elitist restaurant-quality food. But soon, it began showing up in fast food chains like White Castle and Umami Burger, and eventually with one of the big ones, Burger King. Impossible likes to say that the Impossible Whopper at Burger King is for those customers who eat fast food meat and just like the taste of it. So they managed to filter down from elite restaurants to widely available affordable fast food chains without losing any of their buzz or their appeal to actual meat eaters. It's just one example of how much power restaurants and chefs have in deciding what's cool and what we eat.
So today we want to talk about food in a way that every one of us can relate to. The cooking and serving of food, specifically in the restaurant setting. We're happy to order in or eat out rather than cook for one or two today. And we've outsourced our cooking to industrial or cloud kitchens. And meals tend to happen in restaurants rather than home. So how or where we eat is clearly going to decide what we eat. The big acid test for the future of food will probably be in restaurants, as they'll be the first point of entry for all new trends. And like the David Chang Impossible Burger story shows, these things filter down from the restaurants and tastemakers to fast food chains and QSRs and eventually our kitchens and homes. So we want to talk to someone who can spill some secrets about why we eat the way we do and how restaurants of the future will be serving our food. Gauri Devidayal is part of a select group of restaurateurs who have started and successfully run not one, not two, but 3 restaurants in what is one of the toughest markets in the world. I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the communications specialist at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Varun Deshpande, the managing director at the Good Food Institute India. And you're listening to Feeding 10 Billion.
Gauri, thank you so much for joining us. You've been instrumental in bringing the San Francisco style of dining to Mumbai with a focus on fresh, seasonal, locally sourced ingredients with restaurants like your Table, Misty in Colaba, as well as Magazine Street Kitchen. And you took a plunge into the startup life after nearly a decade in UK as a CA with PricewaterhouseCoopers and KPMG. Can you tell us a little bit about why you leapt into the restaurant scene at a time when globally the trend is that majority of restaurants tend to last between 1 to 3 years? And now you're entering your 8th year with the Table. What's your secret sauce?
Well, thank you for having me. Yes, it was a crazy, completely made no sense kind of thing to do at the time. And pretty much everyone tried to talk Jay, my husband, and me out of it. It sort of precedes everything that we've done so far in the last 8 or 9 years, which is, it doesn't make sense, but let's do it anyway. And, we both love food. The city was in a very nascent stage of dining, and the restaurant scene in Bombay was in a very sort of undeveloped sort of phase of its life. And we could see that there was need for more good food and restaurants in the city. Didn't mean we were the ones who had to do it, but that there's never been any logic to what we've done. So we did it anyway.
And the city is grateful to have these restaurants around, I guess.
Thank you.
Gauri, you've pioneered the concept of tapa-style, small plates, communal dining, and really committed to the farm-to-table concept, right? So you have chemical-free produce from your farm in Alibag, which makes it to your restaurant menus now, right? The question I want to ask is, to what extent do you see this sustainable dining or this farm-to-table concept? Can it scale? Is everyone going to be able to eat like this, or what are the barriers to that happening?
So honestly, we were very lucky because we did happen to have this land in Alibag and our restaurant is in Colaba. And so in terms of proximity, logistically it worked out. And we had this land where we were growing for our own personal consumption. And, the whole sort of growing for the restaurant kind of happened accidentally because we one day just had this surplus of spinach, and after giving it to literally everyone I knew, I didn't know what to do with it. And I just left it at the restaurant and said, here, you guys can, use this where you use it. And the next day they were just like, where did you get that spinach? We want more of it, which is kind of when the penny dropped. And I said, why didn't, I think of doing this earlier, but we should be growing for the restaurant. So it's not a huge piece of land, and it's something that over the last 5 years has developed. So we had to start firstly with completely changing the soil on the land because I didn't know what was going into it before. And then we started with a very small patch, and it's grown over the years in terms of area, but also in terms of the type of things that we're growing there. So I do admit that the first reason we started thinking of growing something was microgreens were just becoming a trendy thing, and they were 1,000 rupees a kilo. And I was like, why are we paying 1,000 rupees a kilo when I could be growing this on the farm? And that's kind of how it got started. There was no intention of following any trend. It was partly because we could taste the difference in the quality of ingredients that were coming out of there, but also we had the space and, why not? So the farm to table concept kind of suddenly started becoming known in India, and every restaurant was like, well, we're farm to table. And I was like, that's not really what it is. Obviously everything comes from some farm, but that's not what the concept's about. It's about knowing which farm and what's gone into the growing process, and following the ingredient literally from seed to the time it comes onto your plate. And we were doing it accidentally or whatever, but we were doing it. So we started talking about it a bit more to the public and taking small groups out to the farm to kind of show them what it takes to put a salad on your plate. And the interest was just crazy, so we realized that people are curious, our diners, or maybe not our diners, but just, consumers in general were very curious about what it takes to grow vegetables in a chemical-free, clean way. And they also experienced the unbelievable sort of difference in flavor and quality when we were sort of, feeding them a meal at the farm. And that kind of brought, another dimension to us doing this, because we realized that there is an interest in this. And there's a reason why, for example, restaurants in California mention the name of the farm that they're sourcing their ingredients from on their menu. And so there was definitely value in this. And we knew that, we were doing something right, and it was worth us investing more and more in the farm. And just a side note, where people think that because it's your own farm, everything's free, and so, wow, you're not paying for vegetables. That's completely not true, because it takes a lot. There's a huge cost that goes into growing your own produce. And that's something that, is an investment which is completely worth it, because the difference in what you're getting and what's going into your system is priceless.
Is it easy for other restaurants to do it if they didn't have access to, say, farms directly?
So I think what's happening now is that obviously, land doesn't come cheap. So it's not necessarily easy. And it's even with the land being, within close proximity of the restaurant, it's a huge effort for us to be managing it. So I don't think it's easy for restaurants to be, just switching to growing their own produce. But what is happening is that a lot of farms, especially around Pune, where they've sprouted up, at least in respect to Bombay restaurants, they are kind of, I think, leasing out plots of land to restaurants. So then that kind of becomes the restaurant's own little mini sort of plot to grow what they need or what they want and what suits their menu. So that's happening more and more, which I think is great, because it's sort of the next best thing to having your own and, investing in all of that. So it's kind of managed by the sort of farm at large, but they are doing it sort of specific to your needs for your plot.
Could you tell us a bit about Magazine Street Kitchen? And correct me if I'm wrong, is the concept basically that we have a massive modern industrial kitchen set in an industrial warehouse, as you put it in one of your interviews? So how did you know that we were ready for something like this?
like with everything we've done, this was also accidental. So the space kind of fell into our hands because it was lying empty. It was a family property. It was just this, and it happened to be in an industrial space. We did not go hunting around Bombay for this location. It's literally in pretty untraversed part of Bombay for most of our consumers and diners. But it was available to us in a city like Bombay. Space is everything, and so is location, but this was not the perfect location. And keeping that location factor in mind, we developed a concept that would work for that location, which was not to do a restaurant because nobody ever happens to be around there, but rather to do an industrial kitchen where you can experiment. It's sort of the opposite of a restaurant in a way, because a restaurant tends to have the same menu day in and day out. And the idea here was that every day it's a clean slate and you can literally do, so we call it a culinary playground. And the idea was that it's not just our team of chefs that would be doing things there every day, but literally it's open to any chef anywhere in the world to come and do something fun. And we felt that, again, this Magazine Street opened about 5 years after the table. And we felt that the restaurant scene hadn't developed as quickly as we would have liked. And this gave a platform for chefs to come in and do sort of their thing without necessarily having to open a restaurant. And for diners equally who were craving sort of new experiences and, different cuisines to come and have that experience whenever possible. So, we have different chefs come in every month, even local chefs who may not have their own restaurant, but, are very talented and want to showcase that talent. This is a great space for that.
Yeah, I think that notion of consumer choice, and then also on the other end of that equation, the lack of infrastructure that already exists for chefs, I think that's really interesting moving forward. It might be a hint of what's coming in terms of restaurant trends 5 years, 10 years from now, right? So we're seeing companies like Zomato, like Swiggy starting these huge warehouse kitchens, calling them cloud kitchens or dark kitchens, where people can create their own food brands and restaurants that don't really have seating arrangements. They have delivery. So is that one of the trends that's moving out into the future that restaurants are taking advantage of?
I mean, absolutely. It's something that even we thought about as a next step for Mag Street, because the compound had a lot of warehouses and we were like, is this the way we can develop this concept where we have different cuisines housed under one roof and basically a pure delivery model. And today that's exactly what we're seeing with, the delivery companies you mentioned. So it makes complete sense. For most chefs wanting to get into the space, the setup cost is one of the biggest hurdles for a chef. So having pre-existing setup that you can just basically rent and do your thing makes complete sense. And then obviously, if it's all under one roof, then logistically it's easier as well for a delivery company to operate out of, rather than have everyone zipping around the city. So I definitely think that the food scene is going to move there. Having said that, I don't think it's going to take away restaurants. It's not going to replace restaurants and dining out, because the thing about restaurants is it's not just about food, it's about an experience, and there'll still always be diners and consumers who want to go to a restaurant and eat outside of their home.
But we do see a trend where maybe in the foreseeable future, we stop cooking so much at home. And then the focus will really be on sort of how sustainable is this process. So sustainability is sort of a buzzword now in terms of eating healthy for ourselves as well as the planet. But what does that mean for restaurants, especially like yours? Is it simply about like looking at how you're disposing of your food waste or reusing, recycling, or that sort of focus? Or is it about how you source your ingredients as well? And how big a factor is the cost in this? Is it cheaper to be less mindful of sustainability, or is it actually in your business interest to care about something like this?
That's a lot of sort of thoughts in that. I think the important thing that I've learned over the years as a restaurateur is not to try and follow trends, but to be clear on what it is that you're trying to offer your guests, what your concept stands for, and then doing whatever works best within that. So when it comes to sustainability, I'm all for doing what's best for the planet and for your gut. I think what we're trying to do with the farm, for example, sort of ties into that. But we haven't changed what food we put on the plate or, what the restaurant stands for in trying to be a sustainable restaurant. We are not trying to be a sustainable restaurant, but what's within our ability to do, we definitely have. I mean, something like getting rid of plastic straws or, and we were doing some of these things before it became a trend. But I think the important thing is to not try and follow a trend, but just be conscious, as a business owner in any field, frankly. So for example, like I said, with plastic straws, and then there was even a plastic ban, for example, that came in. But the important thing is, and this is where the cost question comes in, is that when you want restaurants or the industry at large to think in a certain way and be more conscious, you have to provide the alternatives for them to be able to go in that direction. So, one of the biggest failings with the plastic ban was that everyone was being fined left, right, and center, but there were no alternatives out there. For example, to change your takeaway packaging to sort of non-plastic, or to, offer non-plastic carry bags or whatever. The change didn't happen in sync with this enforcement. And that was the biggest learning, I think, even for the regulators, which was that it has to happen in parallel. So it's the same thing when it comes to ingredients, is that, when you are trying to make the consumer as well as the restaurateur or chef more conscious of sustainability, firstly have an alternative that they can possibly switch to. And cost is a very important aspect of that, because as much as I might want to do it, if my customer is not going to pay for it, it doesn't really matter. So there has to be awareness on both sides. And I think it has to be realistic. I mean, it might just take longer than is happening in the rest of the world in India, because the fact is that India is a hugely, hugely price-sensitive market. So it drives pretty much everything you do. I mean, in the case of our restaurant, people even say that fine dining is dying a slow death because people don't want to spend that much when they go out to eat. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think the fact is that clientele is very price sensitive. So you have to be conscious of that when you're making decisions about sustainability or anything else for that matter.
That's really interesting. I think the point about alternatives, of course, it dovetails really well with our theory of change, which is that on the supply side, you have to create alternatives that actually appeal to everyone who serves them and everyone who eats them on the basis of, price, taste, convenience, all of those things. And then once you satisfy those parameters, then people can think about sustainability as the most important thing and make a switch that doesn't feel like a sacrifice, right?
Sure.
And we're seeing this in the largest companies in the world. Let's say innovation is a bit of a halo effect. So with Apple, its share price is constantly affected by the fact that people are wondering what they're going to come out with next. And it's probably undervalued for that reason, right? I think that the next halo effect, which is already happening right now and is going to take off in a much bigger way in the future, is sustainability, right alongside innovation. But what you're saying is that the thing that underpins all of this in markets like India, and that is what we care about at the Good Food Institute India, is India, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. In these markets, you're saying cost is going to underpin everything, right? So you have to trade that off, cost versus pallets and all of those things?
Yeah, I think, in our case, it's important not to compromise on quality. So it's not about trying to fit into a particular trend at the cost of quality. So even when we're talking about like alternative, ingredients or alternatives to less sustainable, foods, the primary thing, at least in what I believe and what we've always followed at the table and, all of our establishments, is quality is primo. And if that comes at a certain cost, so be it, whether it's a financial cost or sustainability, unfortunately. However, I agree with you that the consumer is getting more aware, more conscious of things like sustainability. But in India, it's not there yet, where it's affecting decisions to a large enough extent to make an impact. And that's due to many things, like we said, cost, availability of alternatives, awareness. So the ball has definitely started rolling, but it's got a long way to go before it's going to have, a large enough impact on decision making. And from all those factors that I mentioned earlier, I think cost is the biggest driver.
Moving on, when we spoke about doing this podcast, you mentioned to me that if you have a local ingredient that's not up to quality or up to mark, you don't mind importing, say, duck, to make sure that it's on your menu and it's the quality that you want to serve to your consumer. Now, that's something that's coming from, you want to see a different meat on your menu. It's not really from consumer feedback. Mm-hmm. But say for argument's sake, and, in the future, 5 years from now, the quality is uneven or it's not easy to procure because supply is uneven. Would you then make a switch on your menu for, say, something like cell-based duck or bluefin tuna once economies of scale set in? This will possibly be, cheaper than what it is currently. Currently, it's prohibitively expensive, but would you then say that you could make that simple switch from importing duck to, say, serving cell-based meat on your menu?
I don't want to say never. I think it's definitely something, that we would be open to, provided, like I said, tastes, flavors, quality, etc. are not compromised, and that our consumer understands this product as well. Because this isn't like saying I'm switching from yellowfin to bluefin. This is a completely different, new, sort of artificially produced meat product, for example. So it's very, very important that our consumer understands what goes into making this and is happy to be eating it. So, that for us is important, as long as, like I said, quality is not compromised. And obviously, again, that C word of cost is... but assuming all else is equal, I don't see why it can't move in that direction.
Again, that's really interesting because what's happening internationally is there is this move towards more plant-based diets, and a lot of that is associated with consumers becoming more aware of what's been going on, let's say, in the meat industry over decades, and also at the same time now having an alternative to switch to, right? So over the next years, as Ramya said, if cell-based bluefin tuna comes on the market and the producers say, you have the ability to look at our supply chain, you have the ability to look at how we're making this stuff, this is an option for you to choose for a restaurateur or a consumer. This seems to be working internationally, right? It's especially on the plant-based side because cell-based is not yet in the market.
Currently in the West, it's burgers, sausages.
Sure.
It's a product that they consume the most in the fast food format. In India, it's not so homogenous. We're a very diverse set of eaters.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard to sort of say, hey, just make biryani with this.
Exactly.
So do you have insight on how we eat in terms of, maybe if you want to make a plant-based product here, in India, you would have to think of XYZ because we think of our meat in XYZ ways.
So I want to say at the outset, I'm not a chef. So this is purely from, just me as a consumer.
Yeah.
I think one thing is that India's eating patterns are hugely diverse. So it's not like in the West where burgers are a across-the-board phenomenon. In India, burgers aren't even really, a thing. It's more the local cuisine that takes shape in various different forms, from biryani to, seafood to whatever. So I think understanding Indian food, for starters, is going to be really important because, just talking about biryani, for example, a lot of flavor comes from the bone. A lot of pleasure of eating biryani is sucking the marrow out of a bone. How are you going to replace that with, a plant-based alternative? So that's just one example. And, that's going to be definitely a big challenge in India because local food, the sort of each part of the country having its own food there's a reason, that's led to that kind of cuisine, whether it's in the mountains or whether it's, the coastal cuisine. So I don't think it's as easy to just switch. When you're talking about restaurants, it's slightly different because they're buying ingredients, sourcing ingredients and, cooking it in a certain way. And it may be easier to make that switch. I mean, putting India aside for a second, if you look at Wagyu beef that comes from Japan, there's a reason why it's the most expensive beef in the world, compared to like whatever, Australian Kobe, whatever. So if your alternatives, can they actually replicate that quality, that flavor that you get from Wagyu, for which you pay a huge premium? That's the big question. And that's the point, really, that, the different meats, the different cuts, the different bones, the sort of innards that have made their way, whether it's like offal, whether it's, there's so much tradition that's gone into a lot of food anywhere in the world, forget just India. I don't know how the alternatives would be able to, match that in a way. I don't know. I'm not sort of saying they can or can't, but I just don't know at this point because we haven't had that chance to sort of really try the product yet. But I think that's going to be a huge challenge, especially in a place like India.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think obviously some products will be less easy to do than others. So I think offal or bone might be more difficult. But the fact remains that, most people that currently eat meat and will do so in places like India over the next decades will also get their meat from an industrialized process, which gives you like highly, standardized chunks. It's going to be more focused on chicken breasts rather than bones and things like that. So that's kind of how we see this evolving as well. And I think plant-based and cell-based is really well placed to target that, whether it's at the top end of the market. So with Wagyu beef or bluefin tuna we talked about earlier, right? The reason people love Wagyu beef abroad is that the cows are massaged and they're these happy cows and they're raised in a certain way, which is not possible to do for everyone, right? So and bluefin tuna is this beautiful fish that's unfortunately dwindling as a result of overfishing. And so the supply side is a problem. What cell-based can do and what plant-based can do is you can dictate the exact fat to protein ratio. You can have the exact quality that you want in every cut of meat every single time. It may even be possible if we're taking a 2050 lens and saying feeding 10 billion people by 2050 to say, let's get that quality and those safety parameters in for everyone all the time so that we create new normals in meat. We make it more available to everyone. But yeah, it's a great point. I think that, those questions of flavor coming from the bone and all of those things are yet to be worked out, which is really interesting and exciting, I think.
So, as you know, our nonprofit works on advancing the sector of plant-based meat, eggs and dairy, as well as cell-based meat. Globally, we've seen plant-based burgers make this big splash. Beyond just had a big IPO. Impossible Burger is available in chains like Burger King and White Castle. And high-profile chefs like David Chang have thrown their weight behind products like Impossible. Now, he's a hardcore meat eater, and he's actually loved the taste of the Impossible Burger and served it. Version 1 was made from textured potato and wheat protein as well as coconut fat. The second version, which, blew the socks off everyone at the CES show in Vegas this year, is made from soy and it's gluten-free. So Impossible, we have seen, has done this thing of sort of leveraging its appeal and influence of high-profile chefs like David Chang to spread the word about their products. Is this the way that products in India could also have an in with the Indian consumer? Would you, for instance, think of, sort of, if a chef recommended a plant-based product, would that make it more palatable to serve in a restaurant like yours?
Yes. I mean, for sure. If it's being, endorsed by reputed chefs, for sure it impacts, consumer trends. At the end of the day, I think it's all about personal taste and trying it out. But yeah, I mean, for sure, even forget in India, but like David Chang sort of endorsing something like this has an impact across the globe. So, of course there is. But having said that, again, India is very different from the US, where the diversity that you have in India and impacting, I mean, when we talk a lot in the context of keeping the cities in mind. But when you're trying to reach beyond that, that's definitely, I think, the bigger challenge, because that's where your largest sort of consumer is in a way. But for sure, I mean, starting in the cities is probably the sensible way forward, and having sort of winning chefs over is the first starting point.
On that note, let's take a break. We'll be right back on Feeding 10 Billion.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.
So, Gauri, we were just talking about some great tactical advice for entrepreneurs that perhaps aligning with chefs, especially influential chefs, and understanding their take on things and wielding their influence on the world of consumers and food might be a great tactic for entrepreneurs, right? Do you have any further tactical advice for pitching to restaurants or how partnership with restaurants works? What are the things that entrepreneurs need to keep in mind when they're creating products that might be served in restaurants?
So I think, if this is firstly being imported, I think the first hurdle is, government regulation. And by that, I know that's a whole different topic potentially, but because of that, having regular supply firstly is very important for restaurants, and also being able to explain to regulatory authorities what the product is at the end of the day. This is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge. Honestly, if the product is good, there's enough awareness around there and that it's cost effective, I don't think it's going to be a challenge convincing chefs. I think bigger obstacle is going to be convincing, the regulatory bodies, because it's such a hybrid that, how do you define this? And does this mean we can now have beef again in India? Why would a chef not get excited to know that they can serve, beef again? I'm being completely blasphemous here probably, but that's the truth of it. So I don't think it's going to be that big a challenge if regulation and cost are under control.
So that's another great point. I think obviously wherever entrepreneurs are operating, they would have to adhere to the laws of the land, the cultural norms of the land. So I don't think that, stimulating beef production or any of that would be a bigger part of this, or even trying to import products. I think catalyzing a groundswell of entrepreneurship in this area in India is part of our priorities. And obviously, they would not be beef companies. They would not be GM companies, because we're talking about the laws of the land in which they operate. And the import regime is designed to stimulate local entrepreneurship and local products, right? So when it comes to local entrepreneurs working with restaurants, whether they're mass market or even more, smaller scale restaurants, are there any logistical things they need to think about? Should they be talking to restaurants and chefs early if they intend to serve in a food service area? What kinds of things are hard to guess going in, but which emerge in discussions with people?
In parallel to talking to chefs and restaurants is creating awareness with consumers. So, with chefs and restaurants, there's a limited audience, right? You have to go beyond that to reach the wider audience who then dines in these restaurants. So I think that awareness creation is the first step at large. And then sort of using industry experts in whatever field, as chefs, restaurateurs, that's where that just helps with taking this a step further. But, that understanding of what this product really is going to be the key thing, because I don't see a few chefs being able to just make that difference. It's going to have to happen on a much larger scale, and that can only happen hand in hand with consumer awareness.
Talking about consumer awareness, you're at the forefront of really knowing how we eat, right? Because when we dine out in your restaurants, you get a ringside view of what we're ordering and what we love. And when it comes to meat in India, there's this myth that we're a vegetarian country, but over 70% of us eat meat. Is there a single dish, or is there a certain kind of meat, or is there certain kind of selection that happens on a menu that informs how, these things are ordered, how we like to eat meat in a restaurant setting? Are we more carnivorous in a restaurant setting? Do you see more vegetarians, for instance, cheating and having meat in a restaurant setting?
Restaurants are definitely the place where you go to indulge and you have your cheat days there. But in terms of sort of dining or consumer trends, I would say that there are two kinds of non-vegetarians. Those that, it's no holds barred, love their meat. And then those who are slightly more maybe health conscious and are what we call pescatarians and, will eat the lighter meats. We see, I think, if we look at the non-vegetarian diner in our restaurant, for example, I would say that they're probably split between, those who love their sort of grilled seafood, which is supposedly, much healthier than having, a burger or a a big lamb shank. But yeah, I think that it's definitely split between both.
All right. Tell us a little bit now about the shadowy restaurant cabal that meets every season and decides what everyone's going to eat, right? Because we see this all the time. There are things that are trending, and while you may not subscribe to that, it certainly moves in waves. And there is influence that's wielded maybe at the top end, actually, at restaurants like The Table, but also reaching out into processed foods and packaged foods and all of those things, right? So right now, let's say in the US, haldi, turmeric or turmeric is making a big splash, right? We also see this happening with, let's say, millets in the US and jackfruit in the US, and especially things that are coming from other cultures. So how does that actually happen? Like, I mean, I understand that this is an aggregate of decisions that's being taken in sequence, but how is that feedback loop so quick that people are doing things like cauliflower rice or burrata almost in sync?
Yes, there's this hidden sort of, what do they call the ones where they sit and...
The cult.
Yeah, where they're sitting and actually wielding influence through social media and everything. No, I think it's my sort of very limited understanding of how it's happening, at least in India, is that it's a factor of supply. So when something comes into the market, and I'll give you an example, like burrata, okay, it's being made locally now, and it's being made really well locally. If someone gets, wind of it, everyone wants it. And something like that is available there are very few people doing it. So that's basically, and then you suddenly see it on every menu because this is the new ingredient, sort of new kid on the block in a way. And that's how it just hits every menu till the next new thing comes along, And it's literally a factor of supply. If one of our suppliers hits upon a great product, they'll go out to market to every chef. And then, the fact is that there are a few restaurants that kind of are sort of setting those trends in a way. And if you see it on these menus, then that's basically how it all spreads. What have I said?
All right. So similar question, right? So in the mid-2000s cinematic masterpiece, The Devil Wears Prada, Miranda Priestley, one of the main characters, she says how Anne Hathaway's choice of cerulean blue sweater, which she thought was her own choice, it was not a random coincidence, but it was dictated by the fashion supply chain, right? Right at the top end, which might be haute couture or whatever, extending out into even like Walmart. So is this analogous to how the food supply chain works then? Is that what you're saying, that the supply of certain ingredients just dictates wider consumption trends?
I think so. I think, I don't want to take any kind of credit for anything, beyond my ability. But I do think that, it's that horrible influencer sort of thing. But it is that, it's when you have certain players in the market endorsing or using certain products, that does set trends for sure, at least in the little village of Bombay.
Good. I'm glad I got my Devil Wears Prada reference in.
So if we could do some trend spotting, we see there is some cyclic element to it, but some trends are here to stay. So we spoke about eating local or eating sustainably. There's also a trend towards eating more whole grains or eating organic. And there's also a sudden spike in sort of eating more protein and, eat less carbs, eat less fat. No, eat more fat, eat less sugar. It can get confusing at times, and we never know what trend is here to stay. So if you could sort of put on your 2050 lens on and, gaze into the future and tell us, what are we going to be eating in, say, 30 years from now? How do you, as a restaurateur, pay attention to what's here to stay? And how do you decide, let's focus on this because that's what seems to be working right now? Or do you just discard all that and just do what you feel like?
I think I definitely am in the latter group. And I've never had a sort of special set of futuristic glasses that I wear, and I really feel like I'm probably alone in this little club by myself, but I really feel anti-trends, and I think that it's more important to set those trends, but without meaning to, and just going back to the age-old wisdom of good quality, delicious food. I think that, we have restaurants in this city that have had the same menu I don't know how many years. They just dish that out consistently well. and that's what's sort of held them in good stead. And there has to be something said for that, So I am not a believer in sort of following trends and, seeing what's happening around the world and doing that. And I do feel that at some level, that's what lasts in a way. That sort of philosophy is what, lasts you a longer time than doing, because by definition, a trend is short-lived. And if you keep switching to go with what's trending, what do you stand for? Are you basically a trend follower? Is that what your philosophy is? And if that's not, then, does that mean that at some point you're going to be redundant because you're no longer trendy? So that's been our thought process, at least when it comes to our establishments. So I'm the last person. I have no crystal balls anywhere in my reach.
I mean, that's almost comforting, right? And the success of your restaurant is obviously reassuring here that even putting on a very futuristic lens or not, the thing that really matters is giving consumers what they want and doing a high quality version of it and being really consistent, even thinking way out into the future. It doesn't have to be constant evolution, constant trendiness. Perhaps the best thing to do to evolve is to stay consistent and to give people what they want.
Absolutely.
So, if this is not too intrusive, what is the next big sort of breakthrough thing that could come out of the stable of restaurants that you run? Because if you're not following trends and if you're setting them, how do you know what next trend to set?
Wow. Talk about putting me on the spot. Honestly, we've got our hands full at the moment, but we're always on the lookout for, doing something different and fun. And like I said, it's not about setting trends, but it is about challenging ourselves. And invariably that involves doing something that the city may not have seen, which is a huge risk, but it's also hugely gratifying when it works out and then people follow suit. But that's definitely not the agenda when we set out to do anything. And yeah, right now we've got our hands full with the restaurant that we launched last year. So slowly, but we'll let you know for sure.
Thank you and all the best, because that just means we have one more cool place to go dine at in the city. If listeners of this show wanted to get in touch with you, maybe collaborate in the future, what's the best place to reach you at?
Well, you can find me sitting in some dark corner of the table. So yeah, I'm on Twitter as Gauri Details, spelled Gauri, and on Instagram as G Devi Dayal. And yeah, that's probably where you can find me in the digital space.
Thank you so much, Gauri, for being a part of the show.
Thank you for having me.
We got an inside look at how the cookie crumbles. Gauri is very clear she isn't a tastemaker and is just serving food she wants to eat herself. But it's amply clear to me that restaurants and chefs can shape consumer trends. What's also true is that they can dictate the prospects of companies bringing new and innovative products to market. Whether it's plant-based meats or any other new product, companies need to court and understand the requirements of food service if they're going to win big, like Impossible Foods. They may even need to adapt their products specifically for restaurants, like the company Just did with their egg substitute made from mung beans. In fact, Just launched a breakfast egg sandwich for the Tim Hortons chain in Canada, which helped them sell their 10 millionth egg made from mung beans.
So when they do win in food service, they definitely win big. Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are in over 35,000 combined food service locations worldwide. When Impossible launched in Singapore earlier this year, just 4 months in, they were already in 140 restaurants, which is kind of insane. They were smart about it and they just didn't do an elitist approach. They made it a little more Asian. So they did have Gordon Ramsay serving the Impossible Wellington, a take on the beef Wellington. But they also did a street side food truck which was serving up dumplings. And if you trace back the history of this company, a lot of this was possible because they made the effort to engage and understand how chefs and restaurants wield their influence.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am Varun D7 on Twitter and VAROONFIVE, Varun5 on Instagram. You can come ask me why.
And if you want to reach out to me, I am Cryptic Caprice on Twitter and Dithering Funambulist on Instagram. Please don't ask me why. Join us next week for another episode of Feeding 10 Billion.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.